Hey there, story nerds, and welcome back to the Philosopher, where I discuss the themes, archetypes, structure, and inner workings of your favorite contemporary stories. Now, I'm sure a lot of you squinted through last night's Game of Thrones episode, and I have a lot of feelings. I have a lot of things to sort of unpack here. So hopefully you've all seen it. If you haven't seen it, please stop listening. There's going to be some massive spoilers in this episode. Spoilers for this episode of Game of Thrones, spoilers for the whole show. So unless you're all up to date, don't listen to this episode here. But I wanted to talk today about how I have a few criticisms of the direction that Game of Thrones is taking, specifically in this last installment of the series. And the massive issue that I want to talk about here is a lesson in how to kill your stakes. I feel like the showrunners have a little bit killed their stakes here for a couple of reasons, and I'm going to discuss them here today. The first thing that I think is the really big issue is that ending. And again, major spoiler here, but Arya killing the Night King about 3 episodes from the end of the series. I think that there's a problem with that because basically they just killed their Voldemort. The show has been building up the Night King as the villainous big bad for the whole series since literally day one. I mean, the first episode, the first scene we get in Game of Thrones is the Whites taking out those 2 Night Watch characters above the wall. And it's a terrifying scene. You know, the little girl opens her eyes and comes back from the dead and attacks them. And then they sort of dive into the Game of Thrones aspect where you have Ned Stark and Cersei and the Lannisters and the Baratheons and all that going on. But it's always with this backdrop of there being a bigger, scarier villain than anything the humans can come up with above the wall. And I've always really liked that. I think it's a cool exploration of the human tendency to ignore the bigger threat for the more immediate threat, and the human propensity to be selfish in spite of the fact that humanity is literally in danger. I mean, that's something that we obviously deal with so much in the modern world with climate change and things, and so I think it's a very relevant show. I think that's one reason it speaks to a lot of people. And yet in this episode, they seem to have just done away with that. They seem to have chosen to focus on the human aspect rather than the supernatural aspect. And George Martin has often been quoted talking about the fact that he prefers thinking about interhuman interactions and politics rather than supernatural battles. I mean, he's quoted often talking about his criticism of Lord of the Rings as that it only deals with the supernatural and sort of doesn't focus on the human element and the sort of mistakes that happen there. But I wonder if there's an issue with that line of thinking. And not to criticize, George Martin is a god among men. He's certainly a master storyteller. And I'm not sure if this was his choice or the showrunner's choice, but it seems to me that we humans do value mythic stories for a reason. We value these sort of epic, good versus evil, archetypal abstractions of human interaction more than we value the actual human interaction. And I think a great example of this is how the Marvel movies are doing so well. I mean, even just this weekend, as this episode aired, Avengers Endgame broke $1 billion in their opening weekend. It's obviously immensely successful. The Marvel universe is immensely successful. And I think the reason for that is because the Marvel universe is abstracting these good versus evil battles to a point where it's distantly this wonderful clash between good versus evil, clash between heroism and the things that stand against heroes. And I think Game of Thrones was kind of building up to that with the Night King. And then it sort of just decided not to, and it decided to downgrade the stakes. I mean, not only did they just get rid of the supernatural thing, then they tried to make it in the trailer for the next episode about, now we all have to go face Cersei. And I feel like they just killed Voldemort, and then they're like, hey, we gotta go take care of the Malfoys. I mean, that's just not nearly as compelling. The Night King himself was this amazing, complex, terrifying villain. He represented death. He represented the end of humankind. He represented the end of life itself. And now we're going off to just deal with Cersei, what does she represent? Selfishness, human mistakes, human error. It's not as compelling. And there could be, some people have criticized me for saying this, that there could still be an element of supernatural that's going to come back. And one of my friends had a really cool theory that Bran might actually be the big bad, because it seemed a little bit in that scene where the Night King is going up to Bran, it almost seemed like the Night King might be kneeling. It was almost, Bran was a little bit smiling, the Night King wasn't acting so quickly, maybe the Night King was about to kneel, which would make Bran the big bad. And I think that could be super cool. I mean, that would be amazing if Game of Thrones were to pull about this about face, and they're really known for that. You know, the show is really good about that. They kind of pull the rug out from under us all the time. And so maybe they're going to do that still. I want to hold out hope that they are building up to some other big bad other than Cersei. And I will totally give them kudos for that. I think that would be a really interesting storytelling choice if the big bad is still out there. But if they don't, I think that you just can't make Cersei into a compelling villain compared to the Night King. It's just not going to happen. It's just not nearly as interesting. And even if they do end up choosing another supernatural evil to focus on and end the story with on some sort of pinnacle, I think there's still an issue for all you storytellers, all us writers out there to pay attention to here. And that's that I think they've kind of lost investment. They've just taken a step back in this sort of climactic season. They've chosen to take a step back and make it less intense, which I don't think is a great decision so close to the climax, because even if there is another big bad, right now they're focusing on this human versus human stakes. And no matter what happens at the end of the show, the problem with those stakes is that they're never going to go away, and we all know that. So no matter who ends up on the Iron Throne, you still have this problem that there's always going to be Cerseis out there. There's always going to be human selfishness, human evil. If Jon ends up on the throne, or Daenerys ends up on the throne, or nobody ends up on the throne and everyone dies, I don't even know where they're going to go with it. There's just no way to solve it. There's nothing to root for. I mean, and this has been sort of a recurring problem with Game of Thrones that I have, that sometimes we get into this position where it's hard to root for anybody on the show because the show is so aggressive, and the books too. The story is so aggressively eager to remind us that human beings are these flawed creatures who can never really be heroic. There's no such thing as a perfect good. And while I appreciate the storytelling element of that, I also think that that's difficult because it's hard to get on board with all of the characters, and it's hard to root for somebody. You don't really have a hero, right? I mean, there's no hero in Game of Thrones, and consequently we don't know where we're going, which, you know, as some people have said, I think that there's an interesting flipped nature to that we don't know where we're going. I mean, in Lord of the Rings, it's obvious. You put the ring in the fire, you sort of know how it's going to end. But in Game of Thrones, we have no idea where they're going to take this show, which is cool, but also difficult because I don't know what I'm rooting for. And so I guess that's sort of my major problem, is that in killing the Night King, who was sort of the Mordor of Game of Thrones, you know, he was the Mount Doom, you had to get there. And now they've gotten there, and it feels like the story is over. My other big problem with this episode, and I'm going to sound like a terrible person here, and I apologize, but I feel like more people should have died. And I'm not saying that I wanted more people to die. I like these characters. I am on board with all of these people. But I have a big problem in climactic situations where characters feel safe. And this is the genius of Game of Thrones from day one when they killed Ned Stark, is that no one ever felt safe. You always were wondering who was going to die. Robb Stark was such a surprise. Ned Stark was a surprise for those of us who hadn't read the books when we first started watching. There has always been this element of danger with every single character. And all of a sudden, I'm starting to wonder if that danger still exists, because it really stretches credulity that all the characters survived this battle, because it was such an overwhelming battle, which they did really well. It was really well filmed, and I really had that feeling of tension. I couldn't even sit still for most of the episode. I was so uncomfortable, and that was great. That was really well done. But then they all survived. Not all of them, obviously. There are some very notable deaths, and I'll talk about those in a second. But, you know, Brienne and Jaime were in these awful situations. They were surrounded by whites. You saw them literally clutching onto Brienne's shoulder. You know, it looked like she was going down. And then she's fine. She doesn't even seem wounded by the end of the episode. And Samuel Tarly, is literally under a white. There was a white on top of him with a knife coming at his face, and he ends up being fine. And even Grey Worm, I don't even know where Grey Worm was for most of it. He kind of was outside the wall, but then he was inside the wall. I wasn't really sure. But he's covered in blood. All of his Unsullied are dead. Not all, but a lot of them. And yet he comes out totally unscratched. And even worse than all of that, I think, is the crypt. They really played the crypt up in the previous episodes to be this place of danger. And I thought that was well done. I thought that was good foreshadowing. The crypt was full of all these dead people that were going to come back. We all kind of knew that was going to happen. And yet, despite all the screaming, despite all the panic, none of the major characters who were in the crypt died. Which sort of made it seem just more like a set piece rather than an interesting bit of foreshadowing that would lead to a major plot point. It wasn't really even a plot point. It didn't matter that the crypt dead people came back because it was only faceless characters who died, or nameless characters. And I think that was kind of a problem. I think it sort of shook my security in the show, or my lack of security in the show. It sort of shook me to the core to feel like, I'm not sure if this is real anymore. It didn't feel real by the end of this episode that everybody survived. And I'm not sure. I feel kind of like a terrible person for saying this, but I kind of wish more people had died. So after all that negative energy, I do want to end on a positive note here. I do think it was a very well done episode, and there are a couple of things that were just done excellently. One of those things is, again, spoiler, if you've come this far, I guess you're already on board, but Lyanna Stark's death was really, really excellent. I thought it was emotionally powerful, and I did think that was a classic sort of Game of Thrones moment where they're not afraid to kill a child, that she's young and she shouldn't have been on the battlefield. They tried to talk her into leaving, and yet she has this awesome death that she takes out the giant, she actually makes this huge difference in the battle, arguably more than anyone, maybe except for Melisandre, any one person. So I think that was really well done. It really showed sort of female power. It showed this child's power. It showed her bravery. I mean, here she is being crushed by a giant, and she's not screaming. She's not crying. She's not even really panicking. She sort of just accepts it and then kills the giant. And that was really, really awesome. So way to go, Lyanna Stark. You saved the day. You saved a lot of people from that ice giant. And the other thing that was so good about this episode is the lighting. And I might get in trouble for this because a lot of people complained about the lighting and the sort of frenetic pace of the episode, but I actually think it was great because it's been compared online to the scene. This episode has been compared to the Helm's Deep battle, the night battle in Helm's Deep in Lord of the Rings, which was much better lit. But I remember seeing that movie for the first time, and I remember even thinking, why is it so light? There's clearly floodlights on all these people. It's a little bit too bright. It feels a little bit like Fenway, with Legolas getting on his shield. And I get it. They wanted you to see the cool stuff. They wanted you to see Gimli's battle. They wanted you to see Legolas being an awesome elf. But it did feel kind of fake. And I think that this battle felt really real. They had this frenetic pace. They had the ticking clock. They had the sort of claustrophobic darkness that felt like you were in the scene. I really felt like I was in the scene. I had sort of this adrenaline pumping terror that was cool. I liked it. I mean, I didn't like it. I was very uncomfortable, but it was proper for that kind of battle. It really made me feel like I was present, much in the same way that the Battle of the Bastards made me feel like I couldn't breathe, that you felt it in your body and your soul, like you're there, which is just excellent film. That's good filmmaking. The directors know what they're doing. These HBO guys are really good. And also I loved the piano music when that piano music started at the end, because that's such a thing that Game of Thrones does. They bring in that piano music as if to kind of tell you that something is about to happen. And it really was. I think a lot of people were kind of expecting the Night King to die because there was no way for them to get out of that situation without the Night King dying. But I felt when the piano music started, I thought Bran was a goner. I thought all of them were goners. So in that sense, it really did pull me in a sort of wrong direction, which was good storytelling right there. And another thing that was great storytelling was Theon's arc. I burst into tears when Theon ran at the Night King because it was just so beautiful. He finally had this redemptive moment. His character has just had such a hard time. Poor guy. Almost no one in the Game of Thrones story world has had as awful of a time as Theon. And he really has this moment where he gets to be the older brother and take that position that he neglected to be so long ago. And it's cool. It's really beautiful that he gets that redemptive arc, and comes full circle for him. He gets to defend Bran, who was really the first person he betrayed in the very beginning. So I liked that a lot. Excuse the honking outside. Someone's not happy in the intersection below my apartment. So the other thing that I loved was Sansa and Tyrion having a moment. That was another good full circle moment for these characters who hated each other at first to kind of come to terms with each other. I'm not sure if they're going to be romantically involved. I'm not even sure how I would feel about that. Maybe it would be good. Maybe it would be weird. I have no idea. But it was neat to see that they kind of got on board with each other at the end. You know, they held each other's hands, and I've always thought Tyrion's such a gentleman, and I love that he kissed her fingers and sort of tried to comfort her. That was neat, and I appreciated that a lot. And finally, the best thing that happened in this episode, which, of course, I'm going to be contradicting myself here, was Arya killing the Night King. That was a great, great moment. And while I really wish it hadn't happened 3 episodes before the ending, I feel like that should have been the ending of the show, I love that Arya was the one who was prophesized. Whether or not she was the prince who was promised, I'm not sure if that's the case, but I do think that Arya has been built up to be the hero of this show. You know, she's gone off and done her training montage. She's made decisions that were so powerful and so strong, and in some ways she's more heroic than almost anyone else. And so her having that moment and it being the dagger that started it all, and it being the very dagger that started the Battle of the Kings, is now the same dagger that ends everything. I thought that was really good, really well done, good storytelling, good full arc kind of stuff. So, well done there, Game of Thrones. That was well done. But, again, I wish it had come later. I'm not sure where it goes from here, and I hate to be a jerk, but it's hard to feel motivated to keep... Obviously, I'm going to keep watching, obviously, because I'm very invested. But it is a little hard to stay invested now that I feel like their big moment has been done. You know, the big moment of killing the Night King, that was kind of it. So, I don't know. What do you guys think about it? I would love to hear what everyone thinks about it. If you have opinions about Game of Thrones, email me, tweet me at the Philothesaur, or no, tweet me at Philothesaur, but get in touch. Let me know what you think, because I'm really curious if other people are as bothered by this as I am. And as always, thank you all so much for listening. If you want to support this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or check out my Patreon, link in the description if you're interested. And hope you're all having a great day. Happy Monday. And until next time, until next week with Game of Thrones, see you all later.